Hello, Exiles. Good evening. It is Sunday night for me, and I am finally sitting down to record this for the third time, technically. First couple times, it was just very wordy and bloated. This is meant to be a quick introduction. If you need extra detail, it's all right here in the guide in the wonderfully written notes section, beautifully color-coded for your viewing pleasure. For this video, to introduce you to the build, I want to talk about what our Dominating Blow Architect of Chaos build does, why you should consider playing it, and how reliable it will be for a league start scenario. This isn't really a league start, but it is an event start, which is pretty similar. So, let's address the elephant in the room. 2.6 million DPS. This is not the proper endgame tree, believe it or not. There's a little bit more of a second endgame tree, but I start on this because if you're in solo self-found, the second endgame tree is much harder to acquire. This is generally with basic gear equipped. Level 87 only, the second endgame tree goes up to 94. As you can see, we achieve 85% all max elemental resistances. We have a small life pool, but that kind of gets mitigated by strong endurance charges, block chance, the good elemental res, decent fizz mitigation. That will get a lot better. It's low right now, low-ish really. Physical mitigation isn't the biggest concern for this build because once we get going in maps, we have an army of minions with us who are really just ensuring A, that we don't get surrounded, and B, that a lot of the hits never even come to us. Our Ascendancy takes Chaos Reigns, Fever for Corruption, Forbidden Secrets, and Impure Blood. Fever for Corruption can be swapped for the other node. It's kind of a dealer's choice thing because it doesn't do that much for us. Although 50% increased Val skill effect duration isn't terribly bad, to be perfectly honest. That has good potential for boss fights specifically. Impure Blood is taken actually as a temporary measure that will be expanded on in kind of the what we do later part of the build. Forbidden Secrets is for Everlasting Sacrifice, which is a tremendous amount of elemental maximum resistances, and Chaos Reigns is the entire reason why this build works at all. The tree is pretty basic. We're looking to get a lot of jewel slots because Abyssal Jewels are very strong with this skill. We pick up some basic block nodes as well as minion damage and survivability nodes on this side of the tree, coming down here a little bit more. We get some Warcry support to get our endurance charges online, some max res, and of course Resolute Technique, because even though this plays like a melee build, our damage is actually not important. We just need to make sure we're hitting stuff repeatedly. The way Dominating Blow works is you have your Dominating Blow skill, in this case Val Domination. As you can see, the Dominating Blow half is on the bottom. Very important that you get Val Domination for this build, because the actual Ascendancy notable requires it to be the Val version of a gem, but that does apply to the non-Val version, and that's what's so powerful. Dominating Blow, like many minion gems, but I almost feel like Dominating Blow especially, scales absurdly hard with gem level. 30 is kind of the soft cap, and that's what we achieve. With Awaken Melee Splash at the right level, you actually get to 31, which is, I mean, that's nice and all, but it's not important. We don't have Melee Splash in our links right now because, well, this is kind of a single target setup. It is important to note that this DPS right here is much lower than it will be in maps, because when you have Dominating Blow running in maps, you have another 4 Sentinels. 3 will be magic, 1 will be rare, and they will be stronger than the baseline ones. This does not include the contribution from our Val Sentinels. And generally, even though we're switching Brutality for Melee Splash, which is a major drop in DPS, we do that so that our Magical Sentinels and our Rare Sentinels are able to make use of mods that they would inherit from the mobs that are converted that might add elemental or chaos damage. Another thing to consider is that the entire Behead support, which is about 26% more damage overall, is not being calculated because it doesn't see the enemy is on low life until they get to low life. So for the second half of an enemy's lifespan, they will die much more quickly. That's usually pretty good because mobs tend to get more dangerous as their HP gets lower, just as a general sort of thing. And what you'll notice on top of that makes this build, I think, especially good in ways that it wasn't in the past, is there's no Empower support here. We don't need it. We get to use a different support. In this case, Fortify is put in because it's great for minion survivability, and it's actually just a decent more damage multiplier. You could almost say we've converted that Ascendancy node into a flat 20% more damage and a flat 20% less damage taken for a minions node, which, I mean, if you saw that on any other Ascendancy for minions, you'd be like, yeah, that's great. I love that. So I'm pretty happy with how that's working out. Our damage is scaled through physical. Obviously, we don't use Brutality because we're going to get elemental benefits while mapping, but otherwise, we are looking to scale the physical portion of the hit because that's what's there all the time. This comes from Pride, this comes from Flesh and Stone, this comes from Vulnerability, and it also comes from one of our Spectres, specifically the one that gives us a Pale Seraphim. Because so many of these damage taken as modifiers are more damage taken modifiers, they actually stack multiplicatively. So as much as, like, I think it's actually like around 100% increased damage taken for our enemies when we have everything up and going, We have 2 Race Spectre gems here. You only actually need 1. And the reason it's like this is because I wanted to simulate 2 different buff specters. The second one is an Arena Master, who basically gives us an onslaught-like effect for us periodically. It's not up all the time, but it's up often enough to make things feel smoother and to give us that boost when we need it. It's a very useful buff, and outside of that, we have War Cries. If you don't like War Cries, that's tough. They're too good. They're just too good. Enduring Cry is our big one. As you can see, we don't actually have the buffs active at any given time on this PoB right here. With this active, you'll notice our regen is incredibly good, and our minions' regen is incredibly good. Our minions are actually very durable, which is one of those things you kind of think wouldn't necessarily happen here, but it does. The Sentinels themselves shouldn't ever really be dying on you once you get their level up and you get some of the other things going on. Ancestral Cry is mostly for clear. If you have +1 strike target, you could nix this completely. It does also give us +1 all maximum res, which would take our 85 to 87, and that's rather good. You don't have to focus on that or focus on keeping the buff up, but it is something for you to keep in mind and make use of. Otherwise, exerts 8 attacks that basically have a full Ancestral Call on it, even if it's not in your links. You basically use that every once in a while to just refresh all of your minions as necessary. Otherwise, you're just running around and smacking intermittently, mostly doing the smack to keep Summon Holy Relic going, which is also where your Feeding Frenzy comes from. And of course, these effective hit pool and max hit stats do not include Molten Shells enabled by default. Generally speaking, we are almost strong enough here on kind of the less strong version of the build to tank a fully, well, to tank a full Shaper Slam unbuffed, which is what the calculations are set to currently. The build definitely can get there. That is to say, to tank a full Shaper Slam unbuffed. And one of the reasons why we're not there quite yet is because, again, we're running Impure Blood. That is nice for mana fixing and great for quality of life, but we'll eventually change it to Glimpse Chaos. That's in the notes down here. I haven't exactly figured out how to do that, or how I want to go about doing that, rather. It's not difficult, it's just how much of it we use and how difficult it's going to be to get our resistances in the right place all need to be taken into account before we start teasing with that. For right now, where the build is at, it is strong enough to get you your Void Stones and whatnot to farm maps at T16. We have a lot of effective life, we have a lot of mitigation, we have a decent amount of regen, and we have some okay block, which, generally speaking, those things together will keep you from dying. Super juice stuff and T17s are probably too gnarly at this current stage, but again, Glimpse Chaos is around the corner and will probably be in like the earlier update videos for the build. There's also some added stuff that you can do here in alternative strategies, like in the equipment page, we talk about how, or rather in the notes page, we talk about Brass Dome, and you can see it simulated here. Really good if you wanted to get maximum elemental resistances, just full stop. We run a Darkness Enthroned. This is kind of like, I would say, the one mandatory unique in the build, but the one I'm simulating is only 90%. 100% one's going to be much more expensive for an admittedly decent benefit, but not a tremendous one. Everlasting Sacrifice is talked about a lot. We talk about how you can use Divine Shield to kind of fulfill the need for the energy shield regen, but ultimately you won't need it because we're using so many Ghastly Eye Jewels, and you can get flat energy shield regen on those. Outside of that, we just want to get the lowest possible energy shield roll on a ring that we can. In this case, we have that adorable tiny +2, which you can get. There are mods that go that low. Otherwise, crafted energy shield goes down to like 21, or if you're on a Moonstone base, that can go to 20. And that's low enough to make things feel very smooth with keeping our Everlasting Sacrifice buff up all the time. You'll notice the weakest part of the build, I think stat-wise, is a combination of our armor and our life. In the second endgame part of the tree, you'll actually see we make use of a Elegant Hubris Jewel. This one, I believe personally, is probably the best one you can get for this spot. 105, 140. It gives a lot of damage, and then it also gives us access to this armor node, which actually, that one node alone is worth 10,000 flat armor, because we don't actually have that much % increased armor on the tree. This Lord of the Dead node gets converted to something that's kind of worthless, so you might be able to find something better. If you're willing to take less damage from this, you could look for more armor, which would definitely punch up that physical max hit. This brings us to 12k, which still isn't quite good enough for like a full Shaper Slam without Molten Shell active. But what we don't still have, even in this version of the tree, is Glimpse Chaos. Again, I haven't simulated that in the PoB. That could very easily translate to 32 to 40% increased maximum life with very little work on our part. And that's going to put our raw life total up over kind of a hump. That is our other weakest defensive stat, is our raw life is just not that high. So early endgame, when you've kind of got the character coming together, these are going to be the things that are sought to be overcome. Again, I'm going to make updates to the guide for that, but there's like lots of potential in the long term. These nodes right here might be cuttable, just simply because I don't entirely know that we're going to need this survivability. It's going to come down to how our buff support specters feel. It's going to come down to how Holy Relic does, but Holy Relic doesn't get targeted, so honestly, this is probably just going to be fine. The biggest concerns of the build gear-wise are going to come from needing a +2 minion gem helm and a +1 all skill gems amulet. Now, what I've got simulated here, you'll notice these items have way less idealized stats on them in the simulation. This is to show if you just get those stats and pretty much nothing else, you're going to be okay. Very important to consider that because, quite frankly, +1 to level of all skill gems is very low weighted, +2 to level of all minion skill gems is very low weighted. Those are going to be things you have to work around. +2 to all minion skill gems if you're on solo self-found, this one isn't too bad. Technically, you can kind of cheese ROG to get this on maybe not the most ideal base, but you can use ROG to like find a +1 level of all minion skill gems helmet and then kind of roll it up. The trick is you have to remember not to let yourself get more energy shield because you want to keep that value as low as possible. So item bases matter. And again, the amulet is probably the hardest individual mod to get on this entire build. Outside of that, the weapon is not too hard to deal with. In the past, getting a fractured base on trade was like the easiest way to go about it. And then on solo self-found, you either had to farm fracturing orbs or you just had to muscle it out, which was not a great system. But these days we have the Recombinator. So this is much easier to do. If you're on solo self-found, I recommend getting some bases together, you know, putting one of the gem mods on one staff and then essence spamming until you get that plus one of the other gem mods on another staff and just smashing them together. Because all of our pressure is on the prefixes and they're not particularly rare prefixes, it's not that hard to get this weapon together, especially with the advent of the Recombinator. In a perfect world, we'll also have like a local attack speed roll that will stack with the minion attack speed one there, and it's important to keep in mind that minion attack speed roll also applies to us, because our attack speed is like the only part of our actual attacking that matters, right? We are dealing some damage with Holy Relic, mostly that's there to get us started at the map, and then also to keep Feeding Frenzy up, because that's like another support on our minions. But otherwise, we are leading the pack. The pack is actually doing all the damage. But it is doing a good amount of damage, so there's that. Our Abyss Jewels, generally we're looking for 2 specific suffixes, and then if we could, we'd want to get that Regenerate Energy Shield prefix on a couple of them as well. This isn't as bad as it sounds, it's kind of a bubblegum currency sink. Regal Orbs are the hardest part to come by, but otherwise, I've rolled so many of these, and if you lose 1/2 of the suffixes that you need, it's not the end of the world at all. This is almost a little bit idealized, but also I have them all set to the same stats, so you could get Energy Shield regen on just 2 of them, and then get, I don't know, ideally armor on the others. Might even be worth more. Flat armor, that goes pretty high, and then your Darkness Enthroned is like really juicing them, so if you had the Energy Shield mod on just one of them, it would be good enough in your Darkness Enthroned. Overall, the build needs all sorts of little things, but if you just get a little bit of everything along the way, your build is going to end up being very strong. For instance, if we have an absolute dumpster tier weapon, right? This is just crafted minion damage and +2 socketed melee gems. We still have 1.8 million DPS with everything else. You can cut a lot away from this build and still hit 1 million DPS like no problem, which is kind of insane when you think about it. 1 million DPS on a build like this is at least going to clear maps very effectively, because again, our clear DPS is going to be much higher than our actual bossing DPS. A lot of this stuff comes in to make our single target better and to make the build more comfortable in those bossing situations. If you do follow the guide, if you do give it a try, make sure you find your way to the notes section and you take a look at this. You don't have to read it all at once. It does give you some advice for how to start leveling. You don't have to do it this way, but it does kind of give you a route that will ensure you're picking up certain support gems so that things are coming online as quickly as they can. Smite into Absolution with Summon Holy Relic early seems to be how we get to Dominating Blow. That gives us an excuse to pick up Melee Splash and Ancestral Call and all of that. Ancestral Cry is incredibly good. It's something we didn't use in the past. But with like our little bit of Warcry investment, it actually becomes a lot better to use that. And it's actually just a really cozy way to play the skill, because we don't actually need to be hitting tons of enemies all that often. We just need to be hitting occasionally. The notes section also has very long lines of text about all the different annoyances you could consider. It also has explanations on why certain things are set the way in the PoB. As you can see, we kind of have a bunch of elemental resistance floating here. That's because our simulated equipment doesn't generally have suffixes. There are some suffixes, but those are put there to kind of show that you need them. If there's nothing there, it means get resistance, or get elemental resistance, get chaos resistance, and then I guess like get strength and fill up your requirements for, you know, using your equipment or gems. Generally speaking, the stuff we have toggled over here is conservative. I think the only thing that maybe isn't conservative is I have Pride set to maximum effect, but that's done because the build is designed to stand right in the middle of combat and get right up on the boss, and it does that rather well. There's also a little bit of theorizing that goes into the build, especially in the notes section when you go down to the bottom going forward. There's all sorts of information about stuff that I'm looking into trying long-term, so you can do it if you get there yourself first. and also some conversational bits on like how block is used and what to do if you find you don't need it. A little bit of talk about Warcry cluster jewels and how these can be very powerful for the build, kind of giving you a bunch of armor or onslaught for you and your minions pretty much all the time as you want it. And just overall, the build has never really looked to be this strong while also being this cheap. I mean, Solus, I was gonna play this on Solo Soft Fund. Unfortunately, my buddy is league starting, and that has changed my plans. So now it will be in Trade League, but I'll probably be looking to avoid trade as much as possible. And the reason for that is I just don't need to do it. But also, I mean, look at this build. Aside from Second Endgame, which uses this Elegant Hubris, there's very little in here that you would actively need to trade for. And that should really be highlighted because I'm not using a Watcher's Eye. I'm not using a Thread of Hope. There are so many little things that could yet be used to push the build a little stronger and find a little bit of extra efficiency that we just don't really need for it to get to this point where it's going to clear content really easily. And I hope that's why, if you've watched this video, you're considering it, because again, it is really fun to just run around with a strike skill and hit stuff. And when you play it on this build, you kind of become a one-man army, which, I mean, obviously you're not alone. You're going to be surrounded by your actual army, but you're alone, you're swinging at stuff, and just this wave of people is following you and crushing over the map. It's very satisfying to play. The tree is very simple, it's very easy and intuitive to understand, and all of the stats kind of come naturally. The only thing I would say to like call attention to is if you're playing this build and you're switching to Dominating Blow at level 28, make sure you have Resolute Technique. You can get away without this for a little bit, but it's not going to feel as good without it. You really want to have this. It kind of, there's zero downsides in this build to run this particular keystone. You can see at this level, if we don't have it, we have like no chance to hit. 72% hit chance gone. And actually, accuracy issues like that are why I'm not playing a Dominating Blow of Inspiring build. We don't have Champion anymore, and Champion came with really fun accuracy fixing options both for you and your minions, and without those, I kind of don't recommend it. It seems like it would be very difficult to make that work, whereas this is the opposite of difficult to making it work. Everything here is very smooth and easy and intuitive and not very expensive, but I do talk about some very expensive things you could do. There's definitely, because you could still get an Empower, there's some chicanery involving a Squire setup you could go for, or just an influenced weapon giving you your gems, opening up the shield slot entirely. I mean, I don't think it's ever had this many options for progress like in the Ultra Endgame, because this build right here, what it shows, the level 87 version, if you have all the equipment, I mean, you're gonna, at least the first two Voidstones are gonna be nothing. Uber Elder is probably going to be fine if you're comfortable with the fight. And, well, Maven, I'm not gonna lie, Maven is not the most fun on Dominating Blow. If you're not comfortable with that fight, maybe get a carry. If you know what you're doing, it's fine. But there's a few pitfalls in that fight where bad positioning can create a very poor experience for your minions. And I do want to call a little bit of attention to that. Do not be afraid to call for a carry. If you know how to fight Maven, you probably know what I'm talking about. You don't want to drop the degens in the middle of the arena. Let's just say that. Otherwise, that's really all I had to say. This is my third time recording this because the first two times I just rambled and rambled. I could talk till I'm blue in the face about how this build operates and why I make the decisions I do, but honestly, most of it's written down here. The rest of it, you'll figure out yourself as you play the game. The only thing I want to say is, early on, do not shirk your block nodes, all right? When you get to high-level maps, a bunch of mobs alpha striking you with Cold Snap is going to be like your biggest death potential. 85% cold res 85% cold res with 5 endurance charges should be enough to save you from that, but it will be a lot scarier than if you just had 50% block chance and half of them didn't deal any damage. Hi, this is a last minute edit happening. I was literally about to hit the publish button on the video, and now I have to basically re-render the entire thing because the small notables were teased, and I only just now noticed. I'm glad I checked this at the last second because it's very, very important. Architect of Chaos is getting 4% increased maximum life per small notable, which means that one of the weakest parts of the build, that being a low overall percent increased maximum life, is now covered by a sudden influx of 16% increase that we did not have prior. This is really good. Just as a real quick setup, we'll swap this back over to PoB and show that at the very end, we are over 5,000 life. That makes me incredibly happy. Back to the outro. So yeah, and I don't plan to stream the launch. I might, but honestly, I stream on YouTube and people don't really tune in all that well. I'll probably stream mapping after the launch though. So if you see me streaming, you can pop in and ask me questions about the build if you're playing it, or you can just pop in to call me bald, which is hilarious. Please do that. Have a good one, Exiles.